pawn e4, pawn d5, pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3, queen d8, pawn d4, pawn g6, bishop f4, bishop g7, queen d2, knight f6, castles queenside, pawn c6, bishop h6, castles kingside, pawn h4, queen a5, pawn h5, pawn takes h5, bishop d3, knight b8, d7, knight g1, e2, rook d8, pawn g4, knight f8, pawn takes h5, knight e6, rook d1, g1, king h8, bishop takes g7, knight takes g7, queen h6, rook g8, rook g5, queen d8, rook h1, g1, knight f5, bishop takes f5, pawn d5, bishop d7, pawn d6, knight f5, queen takes f8, rook a8 takes f8, bishop takes f5, rook takes g5, rook takes g5, pawn h6, pawn takes e7, rook b8, rook g3, bishop takes f5, rook f3, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes h7, bishop takes f5, pawn h6, pawn takes e7, rook f8, b8, rook g7, bishop takes f5, rook takes f7. Pawn e4, pawn c5, knight f3, pawn d6, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, Knight f6. Knight c3. Pawn a6. Bishop e2. Pawn e5. Knight b3. Bishop e6. Castles kingside. Knight b8, d7. Pawn f4. Queen c7. Pawn f5. Bishop c4. Pawn a4. Bishop e7. Bishop e3. Castles kingside. Pawn a5. Pawn b5. Pawn takes b6. Knight takes b6. Bishop takes b6. Queen takes b6. King h1. Bishop b5. Bishop takes b5. Pawn takes b5. Knight d5. Knight takes d5. Queen takes d5. Rook a4. Pawn c3. Queen a6. Pawn h3. Rook c8. Rook f1, e1. Pawn h6. King h2. Bishop g5. Pawn g3. Queen a7. King g2. Rook a2. King f1. Rook takes c3. Rook takes a2. Rook f3. King e2. Rook f2. King d3. Queen takes a2. Rook a1. Queen takes b2. Queen f2. Pawn e4. Pawn c5. Knight f3. Pawn d6. Pawn d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. Pawn a6. Pawn h3. Pawn g6. Pawn g4. Bishop g7. Pawn g5. Knight h5. Bishop e2. Pawn e5. Knight b3. Knight f4. Knight d5. Knight takes d5. Queen takes d5. Knight c6. Bishop g4. Bishop takes g4. Pawn takes g4. Queen c8. Queen d1. Knight d4. Pawn c3. Knight takes b3. Pawn takes b3. Queen e6. Rook a5. Pawn f6. Queen d5. Queen takes d5. Rook takes d5. King d7. Pawn takes f6. Bishop takes f6. Pawn g5. Bishop e7. King e2. Rook a8, f8. Bishop e3. Rook c8. Pawn b4. Pawn b5. Rook d5, d1. King e6. Rook a1. Rook c6. Rook h3. Bishop f8. Rook a1, h1. Rook c7. Rook h4. Pawn d5. Rook a1. Rook c6. Pawn takes d5. King takes d5. Rook d1. King e6. Rook d8. King f5. Rook a8. Rook e6. Rook h3. Bishop g7. Rook takes h8. Bishop takes h8. Rook takes h7. Rook e8. Rook f7. King g4. Pawn f3. King g3. King d3. Pawn e4. Pawn takes e4. Rook d8. Bishop d4. King g4. Rook f1. Bishop e5. King e3. Bishop c7. Rook g1. King h4. King f3. Rook d7. Pawn e5. Rook f7. King e4. Rook f5. pawn e6, bishop d8, bishop f6, bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, rook takes f6, king d5, rook f2, rook e1, pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, pawn b4, bishop takes b4, pawn c3, bishop a5, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, castles kingside, pawn takes c3, queen b3, queen e7, knight takes c3, knight f6, knight d5, knight takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop b2, queen g5, pawn h4, queen takes h4, bishop takes g7, rook g8, rook f1, e1, king d8, queen g3, queen takes g3, bishop f6, pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, knight g5, pawn d5, pawn takes d5, knight a5, bishop b5, pawn c6, pawn takes c6, pawn takes c6, bishop e2, pawn h6, knight h3, bishop c5, Castles kingside. Castles kingside. Pawn d3. Bishop takes h3. Pawn takes h3. Queen d7. Bishop f3. Queen takes h3. Knight d2. Rook a8, d8. Bishop g2. Queen f5. Queen e1. Rook f8, e8. Knight e4. Bishop b6. Knight takes f6. Queen takes f6. King h1. Pawn c5. Queen c3. Knight c6. Pawn f4. Knight d4. Queen c4. Queen g6. Pawn c3. Knight f5. Pawn takes e5. Rook takes e5. Bishop f4. Rook e2. Bishop e4. Rook takes b2. Bishop e5. Rook e8. Rook takes f5. Rook takes e5. Rook takes e5. Pawn e4. Pawn g6. Pawn d4. Bishop g7. Knight c3. Pawn d6. Pawn f4. Knight f6. Knight f3. Castles kingside. Bishop d3. Bishop g4. Pawn h3. Bishop takes f3. Queen takes f3. Knight c6. Bishop e3. Pawn e5. Pawn d4 takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Pawn f5. Pawn takes f5. Queen takes f5. Knight d4. Queen f2. Knight e8. Castles kingside. Knight d6. Queen g3. King h8. Queen g4. Pawn c6. Queen h5, Queen e8, Bishop takes d4, Pawn takes d4, Rook f6, King g8, Pawn e5, Pawn h6, Knight e2, Knight b5, Queen f5, Pawn e4, Pawn e5, Knight f3, Knight c6, Bishop b5, Pawn a6, Bishop a4, Knight f6, Castles kingside, Bishop e7, Rook e1, Pawn b5, Bishop b3, Castles kingside, Pawn c3, Pawn d6, Pawn h3, Knight a5, Bishop c2, Pawn c5, Pawn d4, Queen c7, Knight b1, d2, Knight c6, Pawn takes c5, Pawn takes c5, Knight f1, Rook d8, Queen e2, Knight h5, Pawn g3, Pawn g6, Pawn h4, Bishop e6, Knight e3, Pawn f6, Knight d5, Queen b7, Knight takes e7, Queen takes e7, Knight h2, Knight g7, Knight g4, Pawn c4, Queen f3, Bishop takes g4, Queen takes g4, Knight e6, Pawn h5, King h8, King g2, Pawn g5, Bishop e3, Knight f4, King h2, Knight d3, Bishop takes d3, Pawn takes d3, Rook e1, d1, Rook d7, Rook d2, Knight a5. Pawn b3. Queen d6. Rook a1, d1. Rook e8. Rook takes d3. Queen takes d3. Queen takes d7. Queen takes d7. Rook takes d7. Rook e6. King h3. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Pawn g3. Pawn c6. Bishop g2. Pawn d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn takes d5. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e3. Castles kingside. Knight g1, e2. Knight c6. Castles kingside. Pawn b6. Pawn b3. Bishop a6. Bishop a3. Rook e8. Queen d2. Pawn e5. Pawn takes e5. Knight takes e5. Rook f1, d1. Knight d3. Queen c2. Knight takes f2. King takes f2. Knight g4. King g1. Knight takes e3. Queen d2. Knight takes g2. King takes g2. Pawn d4. Knight takes d4. Bishop b7. King f1. Queen d7. Queen f2. Queen h3. King g1. Rook e1. Rook takes e1. Bishop takes d4. Queen h3. King g1. Bishop h6. pawn e4, pawn c6, pawn d4, pawn d5, knight c3, pawn takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop f5, knight g3, bishop g6, knight f3, knight f6, pawn h4, pawn h6, bishop d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, pawn e6, bishop d2, knight b8, d7, castles queenside, queen c7, pawn c4, castles queenside, bishop c3, queen f4, king b1, knight c5, queen c2, knight c5, e4, knight e5, knight takes f2, rook d1, f1, queen takes g3, rook takes f2, queen e3, rook e2, queen f4, knight takes f7, pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, pawn b4, bishop takes b4, pawn c3, bishop e7, pawn d4, pawn d6, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, pawn takes e5, queen h5, pawn g6, queen takes e5, knight f6, bishop a3, rook f8, castles kingside, knight g4, queen g3, bishop takes a3, knight takes a3, queen e7, bishop b5, pawn c6, knight c4, queen e6. Rook a1, d1. Pawn takes b5. Queen c7. Bishop d7. Knight d6. King e7. Knight f5. Pawn takes f5. Pawn takes f5. Rook a8, c8. Rook takes d7. Queen takes d7. Pawn f6. Knight takes f6. Rook e1. Knight e4. Rook takes e4. King f6. Queen takes d7. Rook f8, d8. Queen g4. King g6. Rook g4. King f5. Rook g5. King f4. Queen e3. Queen e5. King g6. Rook g4. King h6. Queen g5.